Imagine Europe in 1943. The war is no longer only thundering along the front lines. It's climbing upward into the sky, where it's decided who will build tanks, who will refine fuel, who will assemble aircraft, and who, in the end, will be able to breathe. The Allies bet on one idea: break Germany's war machine by striking its industry. By day, American heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s, fly deep into enemy territory. By night, the British air arm keeps the pressure on. This is around-the-clock bombardment. But there's one problem that turns the strategy into a meat grinder. The bombers must fly far, into the very heart of the Reich, while fighter cover often can't stay with them all the way. In theory, the flying fortresses seemed self-sufficient. Tight formations, dozens of machine guns, mutual protection through overlapping fields of fire. In practice, the Luftwaffe quickly found the weak points, and the range of most escort fighters early in the campaign simply didn't allow them to remain close all the way to the target and back. The most terrifying part of this story isn't the attack itself. It's the moment the escorts turn back near Germany's border, and the bombers are left alone to pass through a corridor of death where the enemy chooses the time, altitude, and direction of the strike. Even US Air Force Museum records note that on Black Thursday, the Schweinfurt raid of October 14, 1943, after the friendly fighters turned back, the bombers had to fight on their own and claw their way home across Central Europe. That day became a symbol of the price of daylight raids without a true long-range escort. In American memory, it remained Black Thursday, and in a broader sense, it marked the moment it became clear, if the escort problem wasn't solved, the entire daylight strategic bombing campaign could collapse. The National War II Museum discusses this raid as one of the heaviest episodes of the combined bomber offensive, and against this backdrop, an aircraft appears that will change more than tactics. It will change the very mathematics of air war. People will call it different things. The best Allied fighter, the most important airplane, the king of escort. But if you set emotions aside and look at the mission, it becomes obvious why this one mattered. The Allies didn't need merely a fast aircraft or merely a maneuverable one or merely a high-altitude one. They needed a fighter that could escort bombers for the full depth of the raid, staying near them, forcing engagements, shielding the formation, and returning with it. They needed a fighter that would turn the air war over Germany from a risky gamble into a systematic, repeatable industrial operation. That aircraft was the North American P-51 Mustang. But the most interesting thing about the Mustang is that it wasn't born perfect. Its story is the story of a brilliantly designed airframe that first ran into the ceiling of its engine and then received a heart that unlocked its full potential. The earliest Mustangs were created under intense urgency. Britain was searching for new aircraft, American industry was ramping up, and North American aviation proposed not simply building someone else's fighter under license, but developing its own, fast. The concept proved strong, an aerodynamically clean machine with an efficient wing and carefully thought-out layout and cooling. The legend of the laminar flow wing became part of the P-51 myth. Real-world laminarity was finicky and depended on manufacturing quality and surface condition. But the core point stands. The wing was designed to reduce drag in cruise, and that worked in combination with the rest of the aircraft's aerodynamics. Early on, the P-51 had one big problem: the Allison engine. At low and medium altitudes, it delivered respectable performance, but over Europe, the war was increasingly decided at high altitudes, where B-17 formations operated. Up there, the early Mustangs lost their edge because high-altitude power was limited. Britannica notes that the only real drawback of the early arrangement was precisely the Allison's weak high-altitude performance. So the early Mustang in British service and in some American uses looked like this: fast, long-legged, excellent for reconnaissance and strike missions, but not yet the legendary escort killer it would become. The key point is that the airframe was already very good. The foundation was right. Only one thing was needed: give it an engine that wouldn't run out of breath up high, and that one thing proved decisive: the Rolls-Royce Merlin, and, in American production, the Packard V1650 Merlin. With it, the Mustang becomes a different aircraft. Not just faster, it becomes a true high-altitude fighter, keeps its range, and gains the ability to fight where it truly matters, at the altitudes of the daylight strategic air war. Why is range so critical? Because escort duty isn't show up for 15 minutes. Escort duty is hours. Takeoff, climb, rendezvous with the formations, the sea crossing, entering the air defense zone, waiting for attacks, beating back attacks, escorting to the target, escorting on the way out, protecting damaged aircraft, sometimes searching for stragglers, sometimes helping crews survive, sometimes fighting to the last, while always remembering the fighter must still have enough fuel for combat. Any maneuver, any time at war emergency power, any prolonged turn and fuel burn changes completely. And here, a simple, almost unsexy detail delivers a strategic effect: jettisonable drop tanks. Britannica notes that external tanks nearly doubled the Mustang's operational range to roughly 1,375 miles, 2,200 kilometers. That's not just a number. It means the fighter stops being border limited. It becomes deep. It can escort a strike into the very heart of Germany. And it is precisely in this combination, Merlin plus range plus drop tanks, that the P-51 becomes the weapon the Allies needed most. The National W2 Museum puts the impact bluntly. The Merlin P-51 pairing gave the US Army Air Forces a high-altitude, high-performance, long-range fighter that could escort heavy bombers to Berlin and back. And these changes significantly reduced unacceptable losses that had been rising since the start of the Daylight Campaign. At this point, it's crucial to understand: the Mustang didn't magically kill the Luftwaffe all by itself. Air war is a system, but the P-51 was the missing component that allowed that system to function without constantly risking collapse. When Mustangs begin arriving in frontline units in the numbers that matter, the psychology of the air war changes. Previously, German interceptors could often plan attacks as if there were dead zones ahead, gaps where escort coverage would vanish. Now those gaps shrink. Bombers increasingly fly under an umbrella, and it's not a static one. Mustangs could operate not only as formation guards, but as an active force that goes out looking for the fight. And here we reach one of the most important tactical turning points: the debate over whether a fighter should cling to the bombers or push forward and force engagements. Different commanders at different times held different views, but the overall trend in 1944 is a more aggressive escort posture. The more the Allies could do more than merely defend the bomber boxes, could break the attack cycle before German groups reached striking range, the faster Allied dominance grew. That's how strategic initiative shifts to the Allies. The Luftwaffe can no longer choose the moment of attack so freely. It's forced to react. It's intercepted en route. It's caught while climbing, while forming up, while returning. And most painfully of all, it's compelled to lose what is most precious: trained pilots. The most dramatic moment in this story comes when the Allies decide we must break the German fighter arm before the invasion. Because 1944 is not only about bombing factories, it's preparation for a landing, Normandy, Operation Overlord, and it is vital that on D-Day and afterward, German aircraft cannot freely strike the fleet, the beachheads, and the supply columns. From this logic comes the focus on attacks against aviation industry and infrastructure: factories, assembly lines, bearings, engines, airfields, repair depots. One of the key episodes is Big Week, Operation Argument in late February 1944, a series of massive strikes against Germany's aircraft industry. Air University materials cite concrete figures. By the end of Big Week, the Allies had flown roughly 6,000 sorties, lost hundreds of bombers and dozens of fighters. The Luftwaffe lost hundreds of fighters and hundreds of air crew, including a significant number of pilots, and the operation became the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe. Why is this tied to the Mustang? Because operations like this depend on an escort's ability to stay on the route and protect the striking forces. Of course, Big Week wasn't fought by P-51s alone. It was a combined campaign involving different aircraft types, British forces, and varying tactics. But the P-51 was the fighter that made deep penetration less suicidal. Now let's return for a moment to the contentious word best. When people say the P-51 was the best Allied fighter, they often forget to add best by what criteria. If we're talking pure low-altitude maneuverability, the Mustang had competitors, and in certain regimes other aircraft could be better. If we're talking initial takeoff and climb, there are nuances as well. If we're talking about which aircraft could absorb punishment and was hardest to bring down, armor, survivability, structural design, nothing is so clear-cut. If we're talking about intercepting low-flying targets, other stars emerge. If we're talking late-war British machines like the Tempest, that's its own story. But if you frame the question the way the war over Europe framed it, which Allied fighter most changed the rules of the Strategic Daylight Campaign of 1943-1944, then the Mustang rises to the top almost inevitably. The critical shortage was long-range, high-altitude escort, and the P-51 solved that shortage better than anything else. The National Museum of the U.S. Air Force highlights exactly this role versatility. The P-51 was one of the best and most famous USAF fighters, with excellent range and maneuverability, serving primarily as a long-range escort fighter and also as a fighter-bomber for ground attack. This is an important point. The Mustang was not a toy for aces, but a mass-produced workhorse that did two jobs, provided escort, and then became a powerful strike platform once air superiority allowed effort to shift downward onto roads, trains, airfields, and columns. And here the next act begins. Once the sky no longer fully belongs to Germany, the Mustang starts working like a knife in the logistics. 1944 is not only high-altitude combat, it's a war of attrition against railways, motor columns, depots, bridges, airfields. A fighter that can fly far, stay airborne for a long time, and rapidly switch from escort to strike becomes a nightmare for any army, because it breaks the rhythm. It prevents safe daytime movement. It forces equipment into hiding, drains resources into camouflage and dispersal, changes routes, pushes transport into the night when other threats take over. But again, it's important not to turn this into the myth that the Mustang did it all by itself. It operated within a system: radar coverage, intelligence, America's mass industrial output, pilot training, supply chains, and overall superiority in fuel and production. The P-51 simply turned out to be the missing element that allowed that system to operate at full power, precisely where before it had been too costly to sustain. There's another layer of the legend that often surfaces whenever people hear Mustang: the Red Tails, the Tuskegee Airmen of the 382nd Fighter Group. Their story is a crucial part of America's memory of the war and of how people fought for their country despite segregation and prejudice. In popular culture, the P-51 with its red tails often becomes the symbol of the perfect escort. The National Luftwaffe Museum, for example, presents a P-51 in Tuskegee red tails markings and connects it to the long-range escort mission, but it's worth keeping balance. Around the red tails, there are myths, disputed numbers, and legends that grow more polished over time. The central fact remains: these were combat pilots doing extremely demanding escort work, and the P-51 was one of the best tools for that job. Now let's ask honestly, why the Mustang and not, say, the P-47 Thunderbolt or the P-38 Lightning. The P-47 was a superb machine, tough, very fast in a dive, highly survivable, and capable of carrying a heavy ground attack load. Many pilots loved it because it forgave mistakes and could bring crews home even when badly damaged. But as an ideal deep long-range escort over Germany, for a long time it ran into the limits of range, while the war demanded exactly that, depth and sustained time on station. The P-38 Lightning was intriguing because, in terms of range, it could be a strong candidate, and in other theatres it became extremely important. But in Europe it faced operational difficulties and specific quirks at high altitude and in certain regimes, along with questions of mass availability and maintenance simplicity compared to how neatly the P-51 fit the required role. And the British Spitfire, it's a legend, one of the symbols of the war. But the Spitfire was designed and evolved primarily as a defensive fighter, superb in close combat and in the missions it was built for. Its range did not make it the ideal everyday deep penetration escort, always there, all the way to the end, for American heavy bombers. This isn't a matter of better or worse. It's a matter of what mission the aircraft is meant to solve. That's why the Mustang became the right answer to the specific 1943-1944 challenge. It combined high-altitude performance, speed, range, mass production, and suitability for the escort role. And now the most important consequence: once reliable long-range escort appears, the outcome of the bombing campaign changes. Before, every deep raid was like Russian roulette. You might get through, or you might lose far too much. After, deep raids become routine. They can be repeated, and repeatability is everything in an industrial war. When strategic strikes become constant, Germany is forced to spread its resources thin, repair plants, build dispersed production, strengthen air defenses, keep more fighters for home defense, burn fuel on interceptions, and lose pilots and aircraft. Meanwhile, the ground front is closing in, fuel is shrinking, and time is running out. The P-51 did not win the war alone, but it helped the Allies win the air at the moment when air superiority was necessary to win the ground war. That's why many historians and museum accounts call it one of the best, or tie it directly to the strategic turning point: sustained escort, reduced losses, the ability to go to Berlin and back, and the gradual pushing of the Luftwaffe from active hunter into a defensive force that could no longer dominate the sky as before. But there's another reason the Mustang is so often called the best Allied fighter, and it's not about numbers, it's about late-war versatility. Once the air begins to belong to the Allies, the Mustang becomes a universal soldier. It can escort, it can intercept, it can recon, it can strike ground targets. It remains fast, long-ranged, and simple enough for mass use. And mass use is what turns an aircraft from a legend into a force of history. Still, to fully grasp what the Mustang changed in the outcome of the air war, you have to picture what a normal raid day in 1944 looks like. Early morning, an airfield in England, fog, damp air, mechanics running between aircraft. Bombers are already warming up their engines. Around them are ammunition trucks, carts, maps, officers double-checking routes. Crews know today it's Germany again, somewhere out there, a factory or a rail junction. Somewhere out there, flak that doesn't miss by accident. Somewhere out there, fighters that see these bombers as the primary target. And beside them, Mustangs, fighters that must take off, rendezvous with the bomber boxes, and stay with them for as long as it takes. And then the aircraft lift off, climb, rendezvous. The bomber formation stretches across the sky like a flying city. Fighters begin their dance around it, sometimes closer, sometimes higher, sometimes out in front. It isn't chaos, it's a system. Some pilots hold the immediate close cover, while others search for the best interception points. Enemy contacts appear, first far away, then closer. The Luftwaffe tries to attack, and here's the difference. The attack is no longer on schedule, no longer timed for the moment the escorts have turned back. Now they're met, sometimes even before they reach firing range. Mustang pilots move to intercept, and if the Germans still manage to break through, the fight begins near the formation, rather than in the deadly space where the bombers are alone. Visually, it can look like chaos, tracer fire, hard turns, diving passes. But strategically, it means one thing: the bombers reach the target more often, and more often they make it home. And that means the campaign doesn't break under losses. That's exactly why the National Luftwaffe 2 Museum's wording emphasizes what mattered most to strategists: a reduction in unacceptable losses. Because unacceptable losses isn't a moral term, it's a mathematical one, numbers beyond which an operation stops being sustainable. After the big weak strikes and the overall strengthening of escort coverage, the Luftwaffe still has teeth. It's still dangerous, it can still inflict losses, but its strategic position worsens because the war becomes a contest of attrition, and the Allies have more resources, more fuel, more aircraft, more pilots, and more capacity to replace losses. In that equation, whatever preserves Allied striking power day after day becomes decisive. One more important point is often missed here. The Mustang was the best, not because it was perfect at everything, but because it was perfectly timed. It arrived when the Allies critically needed long-range escort over Europe. It entered the campaign at the moment of maximum stakes. Either daylight strategic bombing would become a workable tool, or it would have to be limited, rethought, or paid for at a price that would destroy the whole logic behind it. In that sense, the P-51 is not just an airplane. It is an answer to the war's central question. And if we return to the beginning and ask, how did the Mustang change the outcome of the air war? The answer isn't one thing, it's three. First, it made regular, deep, daylight escort of heavy bombers possible, reducing losses and increasing the strategic campaign's sustainability. Second, it helped accelerate the wearing down of the Luftwaffe in 1944 during the fight for air supremacy ahead of decisive ground operations, including preparation for the invasion. Third, it became a versatile platform that, once superiority was achieved, could effectively take part in destroying logistics and infrastructure, tightening pressure on the German economy and army. And that's why, for many people, when they say the best Allied fighter, they mean this exact package: excellence in the one role that proved decisive in the war's largest aerial struggle.